Top 10 most brutal medieval torture devices ever invented. When we think of the Middle Ages, our minds often drift to images of towering castles, noble knights, and epic battles fought in the name of kings and faith. Yet behind the pageantry and power, there existed a far darker reality, one hidden in dungeons, whispered about in fear, and remembered in the nightmares of history. It was a world where human suffering became both a tool and a spectacle, where devices of unimaginable cruelty were forged not for war, but for punishment and control. Torture in the medieval era was not an everyday occurrence for the masses, but its threat hung heavy in the air. It was a shadow that lingered over villages, towns, and kingdoms alike. The church and the crown both understood that pain was not only physical, it was psychological. A body stretched on the rack or broken on the wheel was more than a victim, it was a message. Obedience, conformity, and silence were demanded, and the instruments of torture ensured they were maintained. What makes these devices especially haunting is their design. They were not crude accidents of violence, but carefully engineered tools of suffering. Some were devised to extract confessions, others to humiliate, and many were created to remind the living of the consequences of sin, heresy, or rebellion. Each one tells a story not only of the victim, but of the society that believed terror could secure truth and order. From the stretching of limbs until tendons snapped, to the suffocating embrace of iron coffins lined with spikes, these devices pushed the boundaries of human endurance. Some are shrouded in myth, their actual use debated, while others are well documented and chillingly real. Yet whether fact or legend, all of them continue to capture our imagination, leaving us to wonder how far humanity is willing to go when cruelty is cloaked in justice. In this journey, we will step inside the darkest chambers of the medieval world. Prepare to witness the twisted genius of pain, the machinery of fear, and the silent screams that echo across centuries. This is the story of the top 10 most brutal medieval torture devices ever invented, a tale not for the faint of heart, but for those willing to confront history at its most terrifying. 1. The rack, stretching flesh and splitting joints among all medieval torture instruments. None was more feared than the rack, a large wooden frame fitted with rollers. It stretched victims by pulling their limbs in opposite directions. Bones cracked, tendons tore, and joints dislocated with each turn of the wheel. Victims rarely died immediately. Instead, they were left shattered and crippled, serving as living warnings to others, used famously in the Tower of London. The rack became the emblem of state power breaking, not just bodies, but also the will of rebels and heretics. 2. The Iron Maiden, myth or reality. The Iron Maiden is one of history's most infamous torture devices, though its authenticity remains debated. It resembled a coffin lined with spikes, designed to pierce the victim's body without killing them instantly. The victim would bleed slowly, trapped in darkness, dying from shock and suffocation. Yet many historians argue that the Iron Maiden was never truly used in medieval times, but rather a later invention of the Renaissance. Still, as a symbol, it perfectly captured the cruelty and fear we associate with the Middle Ages. 3. The Judas Cradle, humiliation and pain. The Judas Cradle combined torment with humiliation. Victims were stripped naked and lowered onto a pyramid-shaped seat, its sharp tip penetrating their most vulnerable areas. Weighted chains sometimes pulled them down further, ensuring hours of unbearable agony. Infection and slow internal damage often brought death days later. More than just pain, it stripped victims of dignity, leaving them broken in both body and spirit. Its use during the Inquisition showed how torture was as much about moral degradation as about punishment. For the breaking wheel, bones reduced to dust, the breaking wheel, or Catherine wheel, was one of the most gruesome execution methods in medieval Europe. Victims were tied to a giant cartwheel, then bludgeoned with iron clubs until their bones shattered. The broken body was often woven through the wheels, spokes, and displayed for days, left for birds to feed upon. Reserved for the worst criminals, murderers, traitors, rebels, it turned punishment into theater. With entire crowds gathering to watch, the wheel did not just kill. It displayed the absolute control of rulers over life and death. 5. The Pear of Anguish. Silent agony, the Pear of Anguish, was a bizarre device shaped like a metal fruit, with sections that expanded when a screw was turned. Inserted into the mouth, rectum, or other orifices, it tore flesh from within, causing unbearable agony. Some argue it was rarely, if ever, used as a true torture device, but its very existence testifies to the cruel imagination of the age. Unlike the spectacle of public torture, the pair worked in silence and secrecy, embodying the intimate violation of medieval punishment. These 5 devices, whether legendary or historically confirmed, demonstrate the sheer variety of medieval cruelty. Some, like the rack and the wheel, aimed to terrify entire nations through public spectacle. Others, like the Judas Cradle and the Pear of Anguish, inflicted private humiliation that cut even deeper than physical wounds. Still others, like the Iron Maiden, live on in myth, reminding us how fear itself can be the most powerful weapon of all. 6. The thumbscrew. Crushing defiance, not all torture devices were large or elaborate. The thumbscrew was a deceptively simple tool, but its cruelty was undeniable. It consisted of a small vise into which a prisoner's thumbs, fingers, or toes were placed. With each twist of the screw, the bones cracked and nails split, sending waves of agony through the victim's body. Its portability made it especially dangerous. It could be used anywhere, from castles to battlefield camps, ensuring that torture was never far away. While the rack might break bodies in a dungeon, the thumbscrew broke resistance in moments, proving that even the smallest device could inspire the greatest fear. 7. The heretic's fork. Silence enforced by pain. The heretic's fork was a metal rod fitted with 2 sharp prongs on each end, joined by a strap worn around the victim's neck. One prong pressed beneath the chin, the other into the chest, forcing the prisoner to remain upright and still. Any attempt to nod, speak, or fall asleep drove the spikes deeper into flesh. This cruel invention was psychological as much as physical. Victims were often forced to wear the fork for days, denied rest or relief, their every movement punished with stabbing pain. It was used particularly against suspected heretics, a brutal reminder that silence before authority was the only acceptable response. 8. The scavenger's daughter. Crushing the human frame. The scavenger's daughter was a horrifying counterpart to the rack. Instead of stretching the body, it compressed it. Invented in Tudor England, this iron device forced its victims into a crouched, kneeling position, folding the body inward until blood burst from the nose and ears. Unlike the rack's theatrical display, the scavenger's daughter worked in suffocating silence. Victims endured immense pressure on their chest and abdomen, struggling for breath while their bodies collapsed inward. Though less well known, it was feared just as deeply. A symbol of how cruelty could take opposite forms, stretching to the breaking point, or crushing inward until life itself seemed to implode. 9. Rat torture. Consumed alive. Among the most terrifying of medieval punishments was rat torture. Simple and improvisational, it required no elaborate machine-only living rats and human imagination. The victim would be restrained with a cage of rats placed on their stomach or chest. Heat, often from burning coals, was applied behind the cage, driving the desperate animals forward. With no escape, they burrowed into the victim's flesh, gnawing through skin, muscle, and even bone. Accounts of rat torture appear across Europe and Asia, demonstrating how the most primitive of creatures could become instruments of horror. Unlike devices forged in iron, this method relied on nature's raw brutality, and for many, it was the most horrifying of all. 10. The brazen bull, roaring death in flames, though its origins date back to ancient Greece. The brazen bull became part of medieval imagination, retold in chronicles as a warning of cruelty. This hollow bronze statue was shaped like a bull, large enough to contain a human being. The victim was placed inside, and a fire lit beneath. As the metal heated, the body roasted alive. Ingeniously cruel. Pipes in the bull's mouth transformed the victim's screams into the sound of a roaring beast, turning torture into a grotesque performance. Whether myth or reality, the brazen bull represents the extreme end of humanity's capacity for cruelty, where suffering became spectacle, and death itself became theater. Shadows of pain that still linger, the devices we have explored, the rack, the Iron Maiden, the Judas Cradle, the breaking wheel, the pair of anguish, the thumbscrew, the heretic's fork, the scavengers, daughter rat torture, and the brazen bull are more than relics of a brutal past. They are windows into the psychology of power, fear, and control that define the Middle Ages. It is easy to imagine these instruments as tools of madness, created by sadists for no reason other than cruelty. But the truth is more complicated, and perhaps more disturbing. Torture was never just about pain, it was about order. Monarchs, inquisitors, and rulers understood that pain could be transformed into a weapon of obedience. A single body broken on the rack sent ripples of fear through an entire city. A prisoner crushed by the scavenger's daughter became a living example of the cost of disobedience. Even the myths, like the Iron Maiden or the Pair of Anguish, carried power not because they were real, but because people believed they could be. In this sense, torture was theater. It was performed before crowds, whispered about in villages, and remembered long after the screams had faded. Whether through public executions on the wheel or private interrogations in a dungeon, the message was the same. The authority of the church, the crown, or the state was absolute. Fear, not justice, was the foundation of obedience. And yet, these devices also raise a question that lingers into our own time. What does it say about humanity that such tools were invented at all? Is it desperation, ignorance, or a reflection of something darker in human nature? The Middle Ages may have passed, but the legacy of torture remains. Even in modern times, governments and regimes have found ways to reinvent cruelty under different names, proving that the shadow of these medieval instruments stretches further than we might wish to admit. Today, many of these devices sit behind glass in museums, stripped of their terror, reduced to curiosities for tourists. But when we look at them closely, we should see more than iron and wood. We should see the echoes of fear, the voices of the broken, and the reminder that civilization has always carried a dark undercurrent. To remember these devices is not to glorify them, but to recognize the depths to which humanity can sink when cruelty is justified as justice. The medieval world may be gone, but its lessons remain. These machines of pain remind us not only of the fragility of the human body, but also of the fragility of human morality. They challenge us to ask, if fear ruled the past, how far are we from repeating it? One truth stands clear. The most terrifying device is not the rack, nor the wheel, nor even the brazen bull. It is the human imagination itself, because it is in our minds that cruelty is first designed. And it is only in our choices that such darkness can be prevented from returning.